if we take a bunch of people and we measure their insulin level today, does their insulin level today predict how much weight they will gain over the next 10 years? And the answer to that is no.
Welcome back to Longevity Roadmap. This is Buck Joffrey, and today I had the opportunity to talk with Stephan J. He is a neuroscientist, and we talked on a topic that everybody is interested in, which is obesity. Really fascinating conversation with him from a completely different perspective. As you know, we talk a lot about obesity and metabolic disorder, kind of all sort of jumbled up into one. And really the primary discussion there has been around insulin and insulin resistance and metabolic disorders and that kind of thing. And Stephan actually thinks we emphasize that point too much. He brings in another concept, which is leptin, and the idea that there is a lipostat, kind of like a thermostat of fat. Various times in my life, I have turned that thermostat way up, but I'm doing okay right now. I would say I'm at room temperature for the most part. But anyway, fascinating conversation, a real close look from a neuroscientist perspective on the concept of obesity and the role of leptin in there. So hang on. Right after these messages, we're going to have that interview.
Hey, longevity enthusiasts, it's time to take it to the next level. I've been fine-tuning my longevity regimen for years, and I look better and feel better than I did a decade ago. In fact, my blood work is even better than it was back then. And it's all because of my data-driven regimen, and it's inspired me to create a course and community just for you. It's called the Longevity Roadmap, and I urge you to check it out. If you're tired of your belly fat, tired of being tired, or just want to optimize yourself for the next 50 years, visit longevityroadmap.com. That's longevityroadmap.com.
Welcome back to Longevity Roadmap. Today, my guest is Dr. Stephan Guyenet, who's a neuroscientist and science communicator specializing in the brain's role in eating behavior and obesity. He earned his BS in biochemistry from the University of Virginia and completed his PhD in neuroscience at the University of Washington. During his postdoctoral fellowship, he focused on the neuroscience of obesity and eating behavior. In over 12 years of neuroscience research, he studied neurodegenerative diseases and the regulation of body fatness. He's the author of The Hungry Brain, Outsmarting the Instincts That Make Us Overeat. This is a book that has acclaim by Publishers Weekly and the New York Times Book Review. Welcome to the show, Stephan. How are you?
Thanks for having me on, Buck. I'm doing well.
So this is a topic that is obviously incredibly fascinating, not just for scientists, but for everybody, because everybody's, obsessed with this culture about, weight loss and that kind of thing. So why don't we just jump right in? When we talk about issues with obesity, you talk about a concept which I find fascinating called the lipostat in your work. Can you explain what it is and how it influences regulation of body fat in humans?
Yeah, sure. So the first thing I want to start with is that the body regulates many different variables, right? So body temperature is a good example. We know that human body temperature is somewhere around roughly 98.6 Fahrenheit. And many of those regulatory systems are located in the brain. And so, for example, the regulatory system that regulates body temperature is located in a part of the brain called the hypothalamus. And there can be disorders or genetic differences that influence that. And similarly, there is a system for regulating body fatness. Body fat is the primary energy reserve of the body, so it makes sense that there would be a regulatory system for it. That regulatory system is located in the brain, in the hypothalamus, and one name for it that I like to use is the lipostat. And so that's what it is. And we know that it's important because when people have genetic mutations that impact signaling pathways that are part of the lipostat, they often develop severely dysregulated body fatness and extreme obesity syndromes.
So let's think about this in terms of what you just said with just sort of this regulatory thing. How different, or I imagine there's significant differences within people, different people, of where this lipostat is. I mean, just thinking about people who generally are thinner people, and, genetically you look at their family, it's a bunch of thin people. And then likewise, you see, a couple of heavy people, and they have children, and the children are heavy. So that's the one thing that's a little tricky here, right? Because when you think about in humans, and you use the example of body temperature, we're all sort of supposed to be around 98.6 or so, but there's a significant variability here. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this points to the fact that body fatness doesn't need to be as tightly regulated as body temperature. If your body temperature was permanently 2 degrees Fahrenheit off, you probably wouldn't survive for very long. Whereas with body fatness, you can have multiple fold variation in body fatness and get along just fine. And so I think part of the answer to that is that just historically, evolutionarily, there wasn't a need for the same kind of tight regulation, but especially on the upper end, obesity was quite rare. If you look back into far history, the further back you go in terms of history and in terms of technology, the lower the prevalence of obesity was, all the way back to, if we're looking at hunter-gatherer cultures, there's essentially, I'm not aware of a single report of a hunter-gatherer that has obesity living a traditional lifestyle. Like, I'm not, of all the ethnographies I've read, I've never encountered a single case of a hunter-gatherer. There are some cases of agricultural, like subsistence agricultural farmers. Occasionally it will happen. But in terms of hunter-gatherers, how humans lived for millions of years, it's basically non-existent or close to non-existent.
Which makes sense, because then you're not actually selecting against obesity, because it was never a problem, right?
Exactly. Yeah, that's where I was going with that.
Yeah.
It wasn't something we needed to select against, because food overabundance wasn't a problem we faced very often.
Yeah.
The main problem was not getting enough food.
So let's talk about that mechanism. I presume it's the one that involves leptin. Maybe you could kind of walk us through some of the feedback mechanisms there.
Yeah, absolutely. So the core of the mechanism is, and I want to start off by saying that it's more complicated than what I'm going to say, and there's probably more elements to the regulatory system that we don't even understand yet.
Sure.
But this is the part we understand, and I'm going to give you a simple version of it. So leptin is a hormone that's secreted by fat tissue, and that hormone enters the circulation and circulates in proportion to the amount of fat you have on your body. So the more fat you have, the more leptin you have. The less fat you have, the less leptin you have. And the brain, particularly the hypothalamus, but probably multiple brain regions, picks up that signal and uses it as a measure of your body fatness. And the brain has a certain level of leptin that it is looking for. And if your leptin level drops below that, it triggers what I call a starvation response, essentially a coordinated physiological and behavioral program to bring back fat to the preferred level. And so you can call that the set point. That's a phrase I like to use to make it easy to understand. Some people have disputed that phrase, but essentially there's a certain level, you could call it a set point or a defended level of body fat, that if you go below that, you're going to get pushback from these regulatory systems. You're going to get hunger. You're going to get potentially a reduction in metabolic rate. Even for the same amount of lean mass, your metabolic rate will be reduced. You'll be more responsive to environmental cues that predict food, like you're walking through the grocery store and all of a sudden the ice cream aisle that you were able to walk by normally, you can't walk by today. And you'll also have a heightened motivation toward highly calorie dense, highly rewarding foods. And so basically all the things that your brain
that are going to make you gain weight.
Yeah.
That are going to make you gain weight, right?
Yeah.
Because you're basically trying to bring in reserves so you don't die of hunger.
Exactly. And it's very similar to how temperature regulation happens. You have this thing that's measuring temperature, similar to how the brain measures leptin. And then if temperature drops, it initiates a coordinated behavioral and physiological response to maintain balance or homeostasis, to get back to the place where it wants to be.
So some people have what's called a leptin resistance. Is that right?
Yeah. And I think it's important first to clarify that this system that I described seems to regulate a lower bound more than an upper bound of weight. And so it's the system that reacts when you lose weight, not a
Right.
system that reacts when you gain weight.
Got it.
And so
Got
I
it.
think that's part of the reason. A question that often arises, people say, well, if we have this regulatory system, then why can we develop obesity? Why doesn't it stop us from developing obesity? And I think that's one reason why, is that this system really is there to regulate that lower bound. It regulates it pretty hard. As we know, like behavioral weight loss, diet and lifestyle doesn't have the most amazing track record for long-term weight loss and maintenance, right? And I think the system is a major reason why. So I wanted to come back to the question that you asked, but I forgot what it was. So can you remind me?
Yeah. So the question is, like, when you think about what could go wrong in this pathway, one of them is a type of resistance to
Yeah,
leptin.
right. That's right. Yeah, and I think that is something that happens. I want to acknowledge that I think not every researcher likes that term leptin resistance. Many of them, including me and other people in my field, would say that it is a valid concept. Not everyone would agree with that, but essentially what we see is that this defended lower bound, that weight, the body fatness at which your brain will start saying, no, we need to turn on the starvation response, that will rise as people gain fat. And so your so-called set point basically will go up and up and up as someone gains weight, to where the new normal is a higher weight. And essentially what's happening at that point is that a higher level of leptin is required to shut off the starvation response.
So that's what people are referring to when they talk about as resistance, then?
Exactly.
Okay. And
so you need more leptin.
how
to
does
get
that
the same
happen?
effect.
Because presumably you have, again, this sort of lipostat, right? Where you're kind of set. Well, I mean, why is it so easy just to reset that?
Yeah, I don't think we really understand the mechanisms very well yet. I can speculate a little bit. I speculated a little bit in my book. I think that there are, I'll put it this way. I think we have some plausible partial explanations. And it seems that part of it is that leptin itself is involved. And so when you're so one thing I want to add here is that leptin, this is part of the complexity. Leptin doesn't only reflect your body fatness. It also reflects how much you've been eating lately. And so if you've been eating a lot, even if that's only had a small impact on your body fatness so far, your leptin will be elevated. And it seems like that elevated leptin is part of what contributes to the leptin resistance. And so having that elevated leptin, and there's probably a second hit as well that has to come together, something about eating an unhealthy diet that we haven't really identified yet. Those two hits come together and may be the thing that's responsible for causing leptin resistance. But in terms of the cellular neuroscientific explanation, there's some evidence around inflammation, that inflammation could be a trigger, but I don't think we really have a clear explanation on a fine-grained mechanistic level yet.
The other thing that comes to mind for me is when you look at people who are in really good shape, right, who've got really low body fat percentages and stuff. I mean, with this system, you would think these people are going to be leptin starved, and their metabolic rates are going to go, way down, and they're going to like have this massive resistance. Well, certainly some people experience that, but a lot of people don't, who are in really good shape. So how do you explain that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think some of them do get pushback from this system. And, one of the things that we see really commonly in female athletes is amenorrhea. And that's because they're placing enormous energy demands in their body, and their body fatness may not be high enough. And their body's like, okay, we don't have the energy to do this. We don't have the energy to reproduce right now. And so we're shutting down reproduction. We're shutting down the menstrual cycle. So I think this is actually something that does happen in athletes, and women's bodies are particularly sensitive to it, because I think, women naturally have higher levels of body fatness and their reproductive cycle is more energy intensive. But I think it is something that we see. And, I've experienced this too in my own athletic life. Back in high school, I was a wrestler, and I went through periods where I was cutting weight to get lean to hit targets for
Yeah.
wrestling. And it was extremely difficult psychologically not to stuff my face with food at that point. I mean, it took an enormous amount of willpower to not to maintain that lower energy intake and lower body fatness in that context.
Let me ask you this. What role does muscle mass have in any of this? Is there any, is there any mitigating benefit to having more mass for the system? Because I would think that would play a role somehow.
Yeah, I'm not sure. So I think using your muscles is definitely beneficial, or likely beneficial, I should
Yep.
say. I think that physical activity does mitigate the kind of upward drift of this system over time. However, muscle per se, I'm not sure. It might. This is a piece of evidence that would support that. There was an interesting drug that went through I think it went through phase 2 trials. And this is a drug that acts in the myostatin pathway and basically indirectly blocks myostatin.
Right.
And so it actually causes people to gain muscle mass.
Right.
And that actually did cause people to lose some fat. And
Yeah,
so,
so that's why I'm kind of curious about it, right? Because in some respects, it seems like some sort of a feed forward kind of thing happening there, and I just wonder what the effect on leptin is.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, on the other hand, people with obesity have more muscle mass than lean people. So
Yeah.
like it's not saving them, but maybe it's just not enough. Maybe it helps, but just not enough for that situation.
How prevalent is this leptin resistance element of obesity? Like when you think of as much obesity as we have in our country, how much of it can we? I would think this is probably a relatively infrequent cause of obesity, but I don't know. You're the expert.
Yeah, no, I don't think so. I think it's extremely common. I would say almost everyone has, no, I shouldn't say almost everyone. I would say probably the majority of Americans have leptin resistance because, let me put an analogy in that I think will help
Okay.
clarify this. So what fraction of Americans do you think have insulin resistance?
Oh gosh, very high. I would say to varying degrees. I would say maybe 70%.
Yeah. So, that's another very important metabolic hormone where
Right.
resistance is extremely common. And so, and it's pretty analogous where, insulin, if you have insulin resistance, it takes more insulin to do the same thing. And that's kind of what leptin resistance is too. Except a side effect of having extra leptin is it usually means you have more body fatness. That's usually the reason why you have high leptin. So I think someone who is overweight or has obesity likely has leptin resistance.
Well, let's use that example of insulin resistance because there's a lot of parallels there. And so, what do we do to treat insulin resistance? Well, part of it is trying to get your blood sugar under control, trying to get more muscle mass, some case medications. What can we do about leptin resistance?
To be honest with you, I think that while it's interesting to learn about this mechanism, I think focusing on the mechanism itself, we're not at the point where that's really more useful than just looking empirically at what interventions are most helpful for weight control. And so if we're talking about practical actions that someone could take to manage their weight, I would say let's forget about the leptin resistance and let's just focus on the practical. Because, I mean, like I said previously, if someone is overweight or has obesity, they probably have leptin resistance. The same way, if somebody has metabolic syndrome, they have elevated blood glucose, they have central adiposity, they probably have insulin resistance. So it's like, yeah,
Yeah.
it's probably something that's there, but it's not really actionable beyond other information that we have. You know what I mean?
Right. I guess we're looking at sort of some of the just mechanisms in terms of why. I mean, for example, reward systems. You mentioned some foods are hyper palatable, right? Is leptin involved with that kind of draw to foods or anything like that?
It can be. I mean, the two certainly have a relationship. So when a person is below their set point, like someone who's trying to lose weight or who is losing weight, I should say, that drop in leptin is a signal that ramps up food reward. So it ramps up your cravings, ramps up your hunger, your desire for particularly favored, palatable, calorie-dense foods.
Mm-hmm. How about stuff that, again, you see a more metabolic disorder with chronic stress, sleep deprivation? What do we see with leptin levels there?
Yeah. So there is some research suggesting a connection there via cortisol is one mechanism. So chronic stress, for example, can increase cortisol levels, circulating cortisol. There's some research suggesting that one of the reasons that can cause weight gain is that it lowers leptin sensitivity in the hypothalamus. So that's potentially one link. And then independent of that, there's also the fact that when we're stressed, we tend to soothe ourselves with food. So when we're feeling stressed, to put it in neuroscientific terms, we can have activation in the amygdala, fear center, anxiety, and eating highly palatable, highly rewarding foods dampens that activity, as most of us know, just, from our lives. So those are two ways that stress can connect. As far as sleep, I don't know how that connects with leptin specifically, if it does. But it does. Sleep restriction in randomized controlled trials does make people overconsume.
Yeah.
And it does increase the drive. It increases cravings and the drive to eat highly palatable, calorie-dense foods.
Conceptually, I want to just go through some other things that you've talked about. You talk about like homeostatic versus non-homeostatic eating. What is that?
Yeah. So the thesis of my book is that there are different brain systems that impact our food intake, and these evolved in a context that was very different than the context that we're in today. And those non-conscious systems kind of push us in today's environment to overconsume and grow fat. And so these systems can be divided into homeostatic and non-homeostatic. Homeostatic means they have to do with regulating energy levels of the body. And so, for example, you have a short-term homeostatic system, which I call the satiety system, that regulates your calorie intake on a meal-to-meal basis. And that's located in the brainstem. You have a long-term energy homeostasis system that regulates your body's energy status in the form of your body fat. That's the main body energy store. That's in the hypothalamus. So those are the primary homeostatic brain systems that regulate our energy intake. And then on the non-homeostatic side, you have basically everything else.
Yeah.
So, and we can eat for many reasons other than hunger, right? So the homeostatic side would be like, I feel hungry. Your body is saying, hey, your energy stores are low, or at least there's a perception that your energy stores are low. So you have a physical hunger sense and you're ready to eat anything, right? Like it doesn't have to be chocolate. It doesn't have to be pizza.
Right.
You're hungry, you'll eat whatever. That's the homeostatic side. The non-homeostatic side is everything else. It's noon, so I'm going to eat because I always eat at noon. It's because, I walked by a bakery and I smelled those pastries and they smelled amazing and I wasn't hungry before, but now I am feeling a craving and maybe some hunger because of that reward value, that seductiveness of that food.
Yeah.
So that's
basically bored eating too.
Yeah.
Right?
There's boredom.
It's what we do all the time. And
There's stress eating, there's emotional eating, there's social eating. So everything else is in the non-homeostatic bucket. And I think there are ways in which our food environment has changed over time. that impacts both of those buckets, the homeostatic and the non-homeostatic. But basically, all of the changes are pushing in the direction of eating more, not eating less.
You've also critiqued to a certain extent the carbohydrate insulin model of obesity. Tell us about that, because that's a big part of, I think what a lot of people think about these days. Insulin resistance and all that. Tell us where you differ on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is the idea. I mean, there are as many versions of this hypothesis as there are stars in the sky. So I'm going to necessarily have to simplify a little bit, but
Yeah.
it's the basic idea is that insulin is very important to body fat regulation, and elevated insulin is the primary cause of weight gain, or fat gain, I should say.
Or at least metabolic disorder, and therefore weight gain, right?
Well, the insulin hypothesis of obesity is specifically saying elevated insulin or insulin signaling is the primary cause of obesity.
Yeah.
And also that the main reason that happens is our consumption of carbohydrate. So we eat a lot of carbohydrate, that raises insulin, and that causes us to put on fat. And depending on the version, some people would say also that calorie intake doesn't matter, that this is a mechanism that operates independently of calories, and that calories are kind of a red herring. And that's the idea that's been championed by Gary Taubes, who's kind of been the primary public proponent of this idea. And my response to that is just like, all we have to do is look at the data and see whether it supports the hypothesis or not. And the hypothesis makes some very basic predictions that we can use to test it that its proponents don't seem to ever want to look at. So, for example, on a really basic level, if we take a bunch of people and we measure their insulin level today, does their insulin level today predict how much weight they will gain over the next 10 years? And the answer to that is no. In almost every study that's been done, with a couple of exceptions, because some studies have found positive correlation, some have found negative, some have found no correlation. But if you look at the literature as a whole, there's no signal. So if you think about, like, as an analogy, cigarette smoking and cancer. If cigarette smoking is the primary cause of lung cancer, which we believe it is, you should be able to see that really clearly in observational studies, right? If you're just looking at people who smoke versus people who don't smoke, you should see that people who smoke have a lot more lung cancer than people who don't. If that's the primary cause, you should see a very clear signal, and you don't need to run randomized control trials, right? If that's the primary cause. Well, in obesity, it's the same thing. If you're claiming this is the primary cause of obesity, which is typically the claim, why is there no correlation between insulin levels and weight gain over time? I mean, this is just like the first question you would ask, right?
Although I would imagine that there is probably a pretty significant correlation with, say, fasting insulin levels and how overweight you are right now.
Yes, absolutely.
Right?
Yes, absolutely. But that doesn't answer the chicken and egg question, right? It doesn't tell us whether.
I guess I see what you're saying. You're just wondering if it's causal, or if it's it's something that is just happening because people are gaining weight.
Yeah, exactly. And
but on the other hand, it may very well have a feed forward effect as well, potentially.
Yeah, I mean, hypothetically, yes. Let me clarify. Like, there's nothing on its face that's implausible about this idea. Like, raising this hypothesis is not a problem. It's a perfectly valid hypothesis to test. All I'm saying is that it has been tested, and many of those tests have not supported it. And so that's one thing. And then another thing that I think is especially important is the genome-wide association studies. So these are studies that look throughout the human genome in huge numbers of people, and they see which locations in the genome are correlated with specific traits, such as body fatness, body mass index, for example. And when you do those studies on body mass index, a measure of body fatness, what you see, you can use those genes and you can say those locations that are associated with BMI, what biological processes do those relate to? What genes are those in, and what biological processes are coming up? Like, are we seeing that insulin signaling is enriched in this set of genes that's popping up? And what we see is that no, insulin signaling is not enriched. We're not seeing genes related to the pancreas coming up more often than chance. We're not seeing genes for insulin. We're not seeing genes for fat cells. What we're seeing is brain-related genes. The brain is overwhelmingly the genetics of high body mass index relates to how your brain develops and how your brain operates. So, and I'm not saying there's never been a gene in insulin, you know, by chance, if you just took a shotgun and just like looked randomly in the human genome, you would find some. But what I'm saying is those kinds of genes are not reliably enriched in the subset of genes that we get back from these studies. Whereas if we look at other traits like type 2 diabetes, insulin-related genetics is all over the place. So it's not like these types of studies can't identify insulin-related genes if they were there. They just don't, because that's not those aren't the biological pathways that underlie differences in body fatness in the general population.
One question I wanted to ask you, because there's like, there was this fad going on. No, I don't know if it's a fad, but I just knew some people who were on this diet. They were calling it the leptin diet. Have you heard of people doing this? And it basically just sounds like a ketogenic diet, but there is no such thing as a leptin diet, right? I mean, it sounds like a big kooky sort of influencer.
I don't think so. I mean, I know more about leptin than most, and I would say that there's not really much of a way, unfortunately, to leverage what we know into actual, you know, hacks or whatever to.
Right. Yeah.
But I would say that I do think that it is helpful, and this is something I talk about in my book. I do think it is helpful to understand that there is a regulatory mechanism, and that is something that you will have to work with as much as possible in your weight management goal. And I think that can make a difference.
Well, Stephan, the book again is The Hungry Brain, available pretty much everywhere. Thank you so much for being on the show today. Appreciate your perspective on obesity.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Buck.
Thanks for listening. A quick reminder that while I am, in fact, a surgeon, nothing I say should be construed as medical advice. Now, make sure to include your physician in any medical decisions you make. And also, if you're enjoying the show, please make sure to show your support with a like, share, or subscribe.